Speciation is the formation of a new species, right? Okay. How does that happen? Well, basically, as two gene pools remain separated for a long enough period of time, mutations can build up in each of those gene pools that will cause those two organisms to not be compatible with one another anymore. Okay. So yesterday we talked about some mechanisms behind this, and there are some that can be overcome and some that cannot. So for instance, a behavioral isolation, just differences in courtship rituals, there could be some random change in which one bird with a different song would want to mate with another bird that didn't have the correct song, right? That's not a deal breaker, essentially. But some of these things are deal breakers. Some of these things like gamete incompatibility, that's a deal breaker, right? Zygote mortality, that's a deal breaker. So eventually the idea is that some of these things are like sort of soft limits on the ability to reproduce together, and some of them are hard limits, like you cannot have reproduction between these two things because there's a gamete incompatibility or zygote mortality or a chromosome incompatibility, something like that, right? So formation of new species, and we can say that a new species may arise when two subpopulations do not mix gene pools for an extended period of time. Okay, and as long as those gene pools are not mixing, then two things can happen. Number one, mutations can build up, new mutations build up in each gene pool. And feasibly, these organisms are not mixing their gene pools because they're physically not able to, right? For either reasons from selective pressure or from a geographic isolation or something like that. And if that happens and they're in different environments, then we can expect the selective pressures to be different. And so different traits will be selected for, and then those traits may not be compatible, right? So different environmental pressures. Environmental selective pressures will lead to differences in phenotype between the two populations. So we divide up speciation into two main types, right? So the first type is what we call allopatric speciation. And allopatric speciation is essentially the exact same as a geographic isolation that leads to speciation. The word allo means different, and patric is like patriotic, it means country. So this is different country speciation. So what we mean by that is that there is a physical barrier in between these two organisms, that the two gene pools don't mix because there's something in the way. There's a mountain in the way, there's a canyon in the way, there's a river in the way, something like that. Something is actually physically preventing these two subpopulations from being able to mix their gene pools, right? Physical barrier. Prevents two populations from mixing gene pools. This is actually the same definition as geographic isolation. So the only difference between geographic isolation and allopatric speciation is that a new species is formed because of it. So you could technically have subpopulations that are divided and experiencing a geographic isolation, but if they haven't had that isolation for very long, they might not be new species yet, right? They might not be physically incapable of reproducing. But if they are physically incapable of reproducing, then we would call it an allopatric speciation event. Okay, so let's talk for a second about how something like this might happen. Okay, imagine that you have a species of snail, right? So okay, here's my snail, and let's say that this snail has some stripes. It's got some green stripes. And it's also got a couple brown stripes. So green and brown stripes. Something like that. Okay? So this snail is living in sort of a grassy area, an area where there's like areas of grass and then areas of dirt and yada yada yada. Okay, there's a lot of snails around there. There's not a lot of predators, and so this snail becomes plentiful, and it starts to experience intra-specific competition. If it experiences intraspecific competition, then the ones that are able to get to the food faster, I guess, the faster snails, are able to live and pass on their genes to the next generation, and the ones that are not will die, right? Or they can adaptively radiate and leave, okay? Let's say the surrounding area contains a mountain range. So I'm going to go all Bob Ross for a second here. So here's my mountain range. Okay, and this snail has two options, or three options, I guess, right? One of the options is it can go up the mountain. If it goes up the mountain, what happens? It dies, because snails can't live in the snow, right? Option number two, it goes around this side of the mountain. Okay. Option number three, it goes around the back side of the mountain. Okay. Mountains are big, snails are small, and snails move very slowly, right? So if these snails make this trek where they're going around the left side of the mountain, we call this the west side of the mountain up here, or the east side of the mountain, right? They are going to be separated for a long period of time as they travel around this mountain, correct? Okay. So if you know anything about mountains, they change the weather on either side of them, right? It's due to the shadows that are created, and also due to evaporation and the inability for water, for high pressure systems to pass over the mountains without raining, right? So let's say on one side of the mountain it creates a different climate there, and on this side of the climate, or this side of the mountain rather, we've got a bunch of pine trees, a pine forest. Something like this. This is what pine trees look like. Okay. So, pine forest on one side, and on the other side, let's say it's getting a lot of rain and has a lot of sun, and so there's a lot of grass on this side. This side of the mountain is full of grass. Ever been to a pine forest before? Is there grass in a pine forest? No. In fact, pine trees are really good at blocking out the sun, and the other thing they do is they drop their pine needles, and their pine needles are actually, they contain a toxin that prevents grass from growing, right? So on this side, it's pretty much just like dirt on the ground. This is supposed to represent brown. I know it's not really brown, but imagine that's brown. Okay, so as these snails move along here, they can pass around the back where there's plentiful grass. It's like a super grassy land in the back, right? Lots and lots of grass back there. Or they can go around the front in the pine forest here. Okay, the ones that go through the pine forest, they're going to have a couple of problems. Number one, there's not a lot of cover here. It's hard for them to go under the pine needles to get cover, right? And also, because the ground is brown, their green stripes are going to give them away because there's not a lot of grass around here. The other problem that they're going to have is that they eat grass, and so they're not going to have a lot of grass to eat around this pine forest here, so they're going to have to eat the pine needles, which is not going to be nearly as nutritious. They're not going to get nearly as much out of it. Okay, so we can expect a couple things to happen. First of all, we can expect for the snails that have more of the brown stripe to be prevalent. They're going to be the ones that are less likely to get eaten, and therefore the ones that would be more likely to pass on those genes to the next generation, right? And then the other thing is, since there is less food available, it's going to select for smaller snails, right? So ones that have less of a metabolic need, right? So by the time that they get over here, let's say it takes them, you know, I don't know, what's a good amount of time? 4,000 years? It takes them 4,000 years to pass along the mountain range here, right? And by the time they get to the end, you've got these teeny tiny squirrels, or not squirrels, snails. Teeny tiny snails that have all brown shells. And look like this. Okay? The ones that go around the back, tons of grass, right? Nothing but grassland back there, so tons of stuff to eat, right? And not a lot of dirt, so it's going to select for camouflage, which is going to be grass, right? Which is going to select for the green stripes, okay? And so maybe by the time we get back over here, we've got these giant snails that have green shells. Now, one of the biggest questions that people ask are, okay, so let's say we are observing over here, right? And we say, okay, here's a type of snail that has a green shell, and it's very large, right? And it lives on the western side of the mountain. So we might call this like the western giant snail or something like that, right? And this one is the eastern snail, and so this one could be like the eastern brown snail. Okay? But the question that people ask is, okay, well, why don't they interbreed here? Right? And so there's a lot of grass over here as well on this side, and there's grass on this side as well. And why aren't these things interbreeding? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, this snail, once it gets back over to the other side of the mountain, is not really fit anymore, right? It's small. There's a bunch of grass, so the smallness is not going to be good for it. It's not going to allow it to blend in, or it's not going to worry about its low metabolic needs. And so you're pretty much only going to find this eastern brown snail in this region here. Okay. The other question that people ask is, what happened to their common ancestor, right? What if this snail over here dies out, right? Because this snail right here outcompetes it. And now all we find is on either side there are western giant snails, right? So now we find the western giant snails on both sides of the mountain, on the left or the south and the north side of the mountain, and we find them on the west side of the mountain, right? And the only place that we find the eastern brown snail is in the forest here. Does that mean that the eastern brown snail is a descendant of the western brown snail? No. They are both descendants of this snail here that wasn't really under a whole lot of pressure, right? It wasn't under a whole lot of environmental pressures, and so it had some random traits on it. And then as environmental pressures led to one snail evolving in a certain way, changing in a certain way, this snail was then able to outcompete this snail in its original habitat and then cause this snail to not exist anymore, right? This is the common ancestor, but the common ancestor is not still around, right? Does the common ancestor have to be eliminated? No. In the case of the finches, right, you still have your mainland finch that probably looks very similar to the way that it did before those finches migrated to the Galapagos Islands, right? But this is just one way that this can happen, okay? Adaptive radiation leading to geographic isolation, leading to speciation, right? All right. This is in contrast to sympatric speciation. Sim means the same. SYM. Patrick still means country. Same country speciation. So this is speciation that occurs in the between two subpopulations that are sharing the same area, general area. They're in the ecosystem. They're right next to each other. They're not actually isolated by any physical barrier. Okay. Speciation between subpopulations without a physical barrier preventing gene flow. Okay, so this can occur because of a couple different things. Number one, we talked about it yesterday. We said habitat isolation can lead to this. Okay, habitat isolation is going to lead to organisms occupying different niches, right? A really easy one to think about is nocturnal versus diurnal, right? So let's say that your species hunts at night, right? But you're kind of crappy at it. And so there's not a lot of food available to you because all the other members of your species are getting all the easy pickings, and then you don't really get enough food, okay? You got a couple options. You can either keep hunting at night and die, or you can try to stay awake during the day and get some food, right? And let's say it happens to be that you're decent at getting food during the day, right? So now you have a subpopulation of that species that is hunting during the day and a subpopulation that's hunting at night. And they're going to have alternating sort of waking and feeding schedules, right? Or waking and sleeping schedules. And so it's unlikely that those two species will then mix their populations. And in that case, that's a type of habitat isolation that's caused by occupying different ecological niches, or basically a niche is basically like what role you play in that specific ecosystem. Right, so they might occupying different niches causes differences in selective pressures. Which can then lead to those populations remaining separated. Okay? The next one is the idea of disruptive selection. And assortative mating. So I gave this example when you were watching the video of me instead of actual me. And so basically we talked about fish, right? And we said that you could have a fish. Here's my brown fish, right? We said that brown fish was biologically fit because brown fish had camouflage, right? And could blend in with the bottom of the lake that they were living in, and so the predators couldn't find them, couldn't see them, right? And that was in contrast to the yellow fish, right? And the yellow fish possesses something that's called warning coloration. Now, somebody in my last class made a really good point, and that is warning coloration only works if you can back it up. Right? So that means like if you are yellow in color but you taste delicious, that's a bad combination, because then everybody knows eat the yellow thing, right? So most species that have warning coloration also have like a toxin or a poison or something like that, or they use something that's called Batesian mimicry, where they are pretending like they're bad. So let's say there is a yellow fish in that same habitat that is poisonous, right? Then they just are yellow, but they're not poisonous. Well, the predator doesn't know which yellow fish is the poisonous one, and so it just stays away from all of them, right? So it's mimicking a poisonous thing. There's two types of butterflies. There's the monarch butterfly and the viceroy butterfly. I think viceroy butterfly is actually a moth, but they have almost the exact same coloration. But the monarch butterfly tastes really bad, and the viceroy moth is delicious. But in areas where you have, I mean, delicious to birds. I don't eat viceroy moths. But in areas where you have both of them living in the same environment, the birds don't know how to differentiate between a viceroy moth and a monarch butterfly, so they just don't eat either of them, right? And so that's a type of mimicry where now this other moth doesn't have to worry about producing the compounds that make them taste gross. They just kind of work off the hard work of the monarch butterfly and say like, oh, well, since they're afraid of you, I'm just going to act like you, right? And we're going to look like each other. There's also another type of mimicry where all organisms that have similar defense mechanisms look the same. So if you think about like bees and wasps and hornets and stuff like that, like they all sting you and they all have that striping pattern. That striping pattern is not the result of common ancestry. It's the result of convergent evolution, where they all converge to have these striping patterns, and it sort of tips off predators to say like, hey, that thing could sting me. I shouldn't eat it, right? Whereas like, a yellow jacket can sting you like 100 times, whereas like a honeybee only gets to sting you once and then it tears out its stinger, right? And so a honeybee is relying on the fact that it looks enough like a yellow jacket to scare off its prey, because it's really not going to be able to do much in the way of defending itself. Anyways, so disruptive selection, assortative mating. This one's got warning coloration. This one's got camouflage. So this is biologically fit due to camo, and this one's biologically fit due to warning coloration. Okay, so we said that the ability to mate assortatively, which means that the yellow ones that mate with other yellow fish will have yellow offspring, and then their yellow offspring will be more likely to live, and the brown ones that mate with brown ones are going to have brown offspring, and their brown offspring will be more likely to live. But if for some reason a yellow fish would mate with a brown fish, they would get a intermediate phenotype, like let's say this weird brown-orange color. Okay, and that intermediate is biologically unfit because it's not light enough to have warning coloration, or it doesn't look enough like the thing that it's mimicking, and it doesn't blend in with the environment. Okay, so this is biologically unfit. So this is basically forcing assortative mating here. It's saying like, okay, if this gene pool remains separated from this gene pool, then the offspring are going to be biologically fit. If they don't, then the offspring will be biologically unfit. If there's ever any mutation that would cause it to be that would cause a yellow fish to be more likely to want to mate with another yellow fish, whether it's looking for some sexual characteristic or I don't know, it has some hormone that makes it attracted to this, or vice versa, where this brown fish is attracted to other brown fish, that is something that's going to make them more biologically fit and make their offspring more biologically fit, and so that would be selected for, okay? In this case, you could have this yellow fish and this brown fish living right next to each other in the exact same pond, and they would have their gene pools remain totally separated. As it remains separated for a long enough period of time, mutations build up and will then lead to speciation. Okay? Yeah?
What causes like the brown fish to be brown or yellow fish to be yellow like before?
Probably a mutation in a pigment, a single mutation in a pigment. Maybe that this is more similar to like the natural reflectiveness of their scales or something, and this one has a pigment that stops that from happening. That's what I would guess. Okay, so let's talk about plants. plants, this is how animals would normally go through this process. Plants have another thing that's called autopolyploidy. Okay. So you got to remember a little bit about the life cycle of plants. Let's say we've got a sporophyte. Okay, and a sporophyte is going to go through meiosis. Let's say this is a 2N sporophyte. It's going to go through meiosis to produce these things called spores, right? So meiosis here. Let's say that it had non-disjunction during anaphase 2 of meiosis, and so that would lead to 2 of its gametes, or 2 of its spores rather, being N, 1 of its spores being nothing, it has no chromosomes in it, and the other one's 2N. So this is not simple non-disjunction, this is complete non-disjunction, meaning none of the sister chromatids separated in this case. So now you've got 2N for a spore. Okay? The next phase in the life cycle of a plant is for these spores to go through mitosis a bunch, and they are going to create another plant that is called the gametophyte. In this case, the gametophyte is N because it's gone through mitosis. In this case, the gametophyte looks a little different because it's 2N. Okay, what happens to this one that didn't have any chromosomes? Nothing. It can't go through mitosis because it doesn't have any of the chromosomes to make any of the proteins to allow it to do that. Okay, so then this gametophyte produces gametes, right? The gametes that are produced are sperm and egg, right? It's going to go through mitosis to do this, so it's going to have N sperm and N egg. Okay, these are gametes. The gametophyte down here that's 2N will make 2N sperm and 2N egg. Okay? The next phase would be fertilization. N sperm and N egg would give you what zygote? 2N zygote. 2N sperm plus 2N egg gives you 4N zygote. And 2N sperm plus N egg gives you 3N zygote. Okay? These zygotes go through mitosis. These are zygotes. They go through mitosis, and they're going to create more sporophytes. Okay? This is a N sporophyte. This is a 2N sporophyte. This is a 3N sporophyte, and this is a 4N sporophyte. Okay? So now, when this happens, right, when this sporophyte is now going to go through the process of meiosis to make spores, it's going to make, in this case, 2N spores. Sorry, not 2N spores, N spores. This one's going to make what? It doesn't, because it can't go through meiosis, right? And this one is going to make 2N spores. 2N spores will always give rise to 2N gametophytes that will then make 2N gametes that will always make 4N sporophytes, okay? The idea behind this, or the reason why we went through this again, is to show you that only just a single instance of non-disjunction can lead to a new species of plant, right? So it only has to happen a single time for a new species to be formed. One instance of complete non-disjunction. And the reason for that is because once this thing gets made into a spore, now you've got a gametophyte that's producing millions of sperm and millions of egg. And those can go on to make millions of zygotes, right? Which will go on to make, millions of sporophytes. What's up?
Oh, where'd you go?
the N gamete and the 2N, or the N egg and the 2N sperm.
So why did you join those?
Because they're in the same habitat, so it's possible that the sperm from one of them and the egg from the other one would end up together. But the idea that I was trying to show you there is that we know that the biological species concept says two individuals have to be able to produce fertile offspring to be members of the same species. And so when this gametophyte mated with this gametophyte, you add the 2N plus the N, they produced a 3N offspring, which is a hybrid, and this 3N offspring is sterile, right? Can't produce gametes of its own. And so what we'd find is within the same field, you could find daisies or whatever that are 2N and daisies that are 4N, right? Or daisies that are also 8N or something like that. So a whole bunch of differences in the chromosome number just based on single instances here of non-disjunction. If this were to happen in an animal, it would be the weirdest coincidence ever, right? So you'd have to have non-disjunction in sperm and non-disjunction in egg, right? Then that would make a 4N offspring, right? Then that 4N offspring would have to reproduce with another 4N offspring. So that would have to happen twice. A non-disjunction sperm and a non-disjunction egg would have to make a viable offspring, right? And then an additional non-disjunction sperm and non-disjunction egg would have to make a viable offspring. And then those two offspring would have to mate in order for that to proliferate. And then that would have to they would have to have multiple kids, and then those kids would have to inbreed, right? And you can see how this is super rare then for animals. Like, you know, basically never happens. Whereas in plants it happens all the time due to their life cycle. Does that make sense? Anybody have any questions on that? All right, that's it.